Okay, here we go again. Just got done reading an article on Facebook about Sasheen Little Feather. Was this native icon princess in the 1970s, and finding out she was a total fraud. Or it looks that way, according to her own sisters, who would know her better than anyone else. So, boy, the rabbit hole always gets deeper and deeper. All of this, you know. Excuse me. Anyway, I wanted to kind of just do this video on a certain individual, somebody who's probably considered the most devious and abhorrent and despicable human being probably of the 20th century. For once, the old hoteps, who I disagree with on just about everything, I would agree with them on this one about the evil white man, and that would be one Theodore Robert Bundy, aka Ted Bundy. To those of you who don't know him, well, all I can say is you should, because there's been a lot of movies done on him, a lot of books written about him. They got two films right now out on mainstream media about him, from everything to his final days to, you know, what he did and the people who knew him and everything else. That one, No Man of God, I would recommend that one. That did give some insight into his character and his relationship with this FBI guy that was trying to kind of get him to confess. Now, as to myself, I've had very much a fascination with serial killers, probably from my teens on. And it seemed like in the 70s, and this was when Bundy was around, that was kind of like the heyday of serial killing. I mean, that there was tons of it. How about this? It was like an epidemic, like the single mother thing is now. Although it kind of started in this era too. You know, this was kind of the beginning of that. You know, I look at it this way. This is the era of second wave feminism, and it had some real dastardly effects on our society. Now, to give some insight into Ted Bundy, I've read a lot of books. I've read several books on him, rather. Watched a number of movies. I've watched his documentaries on YouTube. His confessions and people and family members that knew him, his girlfriend that, you know, he had a ongoing relationship with. There's that Netflix series on him. That dude that plays him, I think, does a pretty good job. The things that made Bundy the most interesting and dangerous, I think, as a serial killer, I mean, was not even, you know what, people say he was a genius. I don't think he was. I think he was I think a lot of things that struck Bundy were, you know, that made him as successful and notorious as a serial killer and gave him kind of this marquee status as a serial killer, was the fact that he lived in a time where, you know, he just lived in a different time. The government was not what it is now. Second wave feminism. Remember, too, there were not things like there are now. We didn't have cell phones back then. There were the rotary phones. Trying to think of what else. Well, I mean, there were no surveillance cameras. You know, you could walk into a place and he was a thief, a compulsive thief and a burglar back then too. In fact, that's kind of what got him into killing was that. And remember, you could steal things quite easily back then, shoplifting especially. I mean, like I said, there were no security cameras. You could walk into a store and walk out, you know, and it wasn't a big deal, you know. It just, and that was the thing. And the cops, and I'm going to give the cops another shot here. They had to do work. They had to work back then. Remember, if a crime got committed, like in one case, Bundy went to this Lake Sammamish and picked up 2 girls in one day, giving them both his actual name, saying his name was Ted. He said he was Ted. And he asked both of these girls to help him with something. And they went with him willingly to their own deaths, you know. Now, and this is the interesting thing, you know, with all that free love and free sex, of course, that tied right into what Bundy was, because he was a true sexual psychopath to the core. He was a deviant right to the core. I mean, his big things actually were murder and necrophilia. If you don't know what necrophilia is, disgusting as this may sound, it's the attraction of a dead corpse, a dead person. You know, preserving a corpse for sexual purposes, and having that power and control over another human being. That's what kind of drives that. It drives that behavior. You know, they're so obsessed with their own power, and they're so how about this, megalomaniacal, I guess. They see themselves as in a godlike way, and there's nothing more so than being in front of a dead corpse to feel that ultimate power. In fact, that's what drove a lot of his killings. He said, you know, his big thing was he had a number of MOs. I mean, sometimes he would stalk these girls and young women. You know, they were mostly teenagers and young women. In fact, just about all of them were teenagers, younger women, and college career, that type of 18 to 25. The very mass majority of his victims were in between. But he also killed teeny boppers as well, from 15 to 17. And his last victim was a 12-year-old, and that's pretty horrific and disgusting to think that. But Bundy's MO was generally this: he would approach girls, usually on college campuses or in malls. Sometimes he'd use a ruse, or be pretending he was a cop or a detective or something. But usually he would come up with he'd do it differently. He'd have a bandage on his arm, or he'd be hobbling on crutches, and he'd say he'd been in a skiing accident, and he'd ask these girls, you know, he'd see them alone, and he'd ask them, could you just assist me for a second? You know, my car's over yonder, just out of the way of general public, out of the general public eye, so he couldn't be easily spotted. You know, it'd be in a semi-secluded spot away from general public. And as soon as this girl would, bend down to help him with his books or whatever he needed help with, he would strike them with a tire iron or a crowbar, one or the other, when they weren't looking. And he'd either daze them or knock them dizzy or unconscious, and when they were in that state, he'd have a pair of handcuffs right there where he'd slap on their wrists, and he'd throw them in the passenger seat of his Volkswagen Bug. And he conveniently had that the passenger seat removed, as he stated later, easier for carrying cargo in and out. Anyway, he and once he had them in his vehicle, he'd drive off to a remote location and have his way with them, you know. Usually, like I said, he'd usually strangle them and then rape them, or raped them and strangled them. Sometimes he would rape them and strangle them at the same time and climax as they were dying. In fact, that's where he said he got his power from, or felt this godlike, a person in this position is God. That's what he confessed to one of these FBI people. One of these whoever was questioning him in the end. He said, "There's no thrill more greater than taking a human life, a person in that position, and strangling the last of their life from their bodies. A person in that position is like a god." And the number of victims that he had is unknown. He told one investigator. He told one investigator. He said, "Well, we'll make it a nice round number, 30. And he even himself claimed he didn't remember. Myself personally, I think he probably killed from 50 to 100 women, probably like 70 or 80, and it was over a 10 to 15 year period. I'd say like 15-year period, on and off. And remember, he escaped from prison, actually, and made it to Florida, and he went on a killing frenzy, actually, there, where he attacked a bunch of girls in one night, killed 3 of them, severely hurt 2 others, and then he killed that little girl, the 12-year-old, raped her and killed her, and that was his last victim. But I think that's probably what he killed, was around 70 to 80 women, all in all. And this was a full-time hobby for him. There were some really interesting things about Bundy, but besides, he was a white guy, for one. He was going to be an attorney. He was very well educated. Most of his killings were in his 20s, when he was actually at the height of his kind of career as a law student, going to law school. He had a major in psychology, even like myself. Don't mean to bring that in there like I'm a serial killer. I'm not. But anyway, I have a major in psychology, and that's what Bundy majored in as well. And that he used that to, I think, improve his career as a killer, and study women and manipulate them better. Take advantage of them, knowing where he could take advantage of them and where he couldn't. But he was white. He preyed on white women. All his victims were white, or maybe possibly American Indian, if they were maybe a little bit, not enough to be registered as one or anything, but they were all white girls, all came from fairly affluent families, all were kind of in that second wave feminism mode where, they were seeking to be independent. That was kind of their main prerogative, was being independent. A lot of them were liberal too, although in Utah, and interestingly enough, Bundy was also very involved in politics. In fact, he ran a campaign, or he led a campaign for some dude running for governor as a Republican. And Bundy did not fit in with the norm around him. He was not part of the hippie or biker subcultures in that time. He was a yuppie intellectual type. I think even that's why these girls kind of trusted him and thought that he was pretty harmless, especially with a cast on his arm. And like I said, with the lack of surveillance cameras and police around, and police, not being able to identify. And Bundy had kind of one of those looks too. He kind of looked like, if you were to say all white people look alike, well, that's not true, but there you can get kind of a visual of certain circumstances, let's say around white people, like say you go to a bar on a certain night, a college bar, you'll see a lot of dudes, white dudes, that kind of have this general look, brown hair, 6 foot tall, wearing a sweater, and I think that's the description a lot of these girls gave about him, and this could, he just blended in with a lot of wherever he went, he could blend in and not stick out. He looked extremely unassuming. People said he was really good looking, and that's always a subjective thing, but I didn't think so. I thought he looked very ordinary. And I even think a lot of women thought he was that way too. He was just very ordinary. He was well spoken, well educated, a little bit slick. But as I were to even think that, I think his own desire for murder and power and his inability to control himself got him caught in the end. I think he could have killed. He'd probably be killing, before the onset of all the surveillance cameras and of course the internet, where you can download stuff, and you got Google. They didn't have that back then. There were no PCs. You couldn't look up any information. You had to go to the library to look up any information on people. Whereas all you got to do now is click on your iPhone or smartphone and get all this information about anybody you want. They didn't have that back then. So that worked in his favor as a killer, and well, let me I'm going to kind of wrap this up. In the end, everybody kind of remembers how he got executed, and he was one of the last people, I think, to be executed by electrocution. I think it was a real late 80s. I was in grade school actually when it happened, and of course the big Hulu. And Bundy, everything was about politics with him anyway, and especially with all these confessions with the investigators and FBI people. He would confess and make confessions and admit to doing things just to get a stay of execution. It was all about politics with him. He made some kind of a confession to right before his execution, and he said he'd become born again and a Christian, and he wanted to talk to this James Dobson. This is kind of remarkable, and I want to kind of tie this in with the red pill, in that I think to a large degree, both Bundy and a lot of what he did and said right here contributed to what is going on in Western culture now, and was largely responsible for bringing in third wave feminism, which kind of sees men as dangerous predators, rapists, being compelled to. It was about destroying actually the male identity, and I thought this was a huge, pretty significant factor in this. Bundy made this confession, besides his bullshit, and I'm going to say that, I think it was a bullshit confession about coming to Christ and becoming a Christian. He'd been a Mormon for a while, by the way. That was another one that was kind of a interesting side note, I guess. But the thing about this is he told this Dobson, and the interview's on YouTube if you want to look it up, and you can kind of tell he's giving a lot of bullshit. When he's talking to Dobson, and he's talking about his childhood and how great it was, and actually, if you look at it, it wasn't. In fact, I think Bundy was probably a child of incest. His grandfather raped his mother. There's a lot of evidence on that. If you want to look that up on YouTube and various groups and Google it, I think there's a high likelihood of he was a bastard, kind of before his time, but I think tied into his killing as well. But I think it was a very likely thing that his grandfather raped his mother, and that's how he was conceived. Anyway, again, kind of another side note, but this confession he made, where he talks about how he as a young boy, came across some detective magazines where it shows women being raped and murdered. And, I mean, if that were the case, that pornography drives people to kill. And I don't want to advocate for pornography because I'm against it, and I was addicted to myself at one time. But by the grace of God, I'm not. But by the same token, how can somebody say that pornography made them kill? Led them to kill? Or it was the contributing factor in them killing? But I believe it was this campaign right there, almost like a war on poverty or a war on terror or a war on drugs, to get young men then maybe addicted to pornography. Who knows? Kind of a subtle move by the government to get men addicted to pornography. And it's interesting he would say that right before he was executed. I just... And of course I didn't believe Bundy. He was a con artist and a megalomaniac up to his dying breath. This was all just a ruse to try to buy time, but he made this confession to Dobson, and this kind of became a thing among evangelical circles that was message was to perpetrate, is that pornography makes kids kill, and almost like guns do too. But I feel that attributed to this war on men and brought in third wave feminism. And if you remember too, he had another friend that wrote a book on him, The Stranger Beside Me, Ann Rule, and she was a feminist. And I wonder how maybe she even could have used something like that. Again, these are all speculations. I'm open to discussion on this. But it was kind of interesting looking into Bundy's legacy and his last days to bring into account how third wave feminism came about as a result of that, and this war on the male identity, and perhaps even the ushering in of pornography. Just find it interesting. I'm glad to have some more subscribers to my channel. Please feel free. I'd like to get up to 100 if I can. I have a lot of material that I want to share, and I feel that may be helpful. So, anyways, thanks for listening.